The wind carried a long, lonely whistle through the narrow canyon as the sun lowered behind the tall red walls, throwing long shadows that looked like moving spirits. The land felt ancient, silent, and heavy, like it remembered every secret buried beneath its sand. A young woman walked through that dusty trail with a tired horse and a small sack tied over its back, her long skirt brushing the ground while her boots kicked against loose stones. She had traveled far from the nearest town after hearing there might be work at a distant settlement near the mountains. She believed she could earn her living with her hands, not depend on anyone, and build a small life with peace.
Nice.
She had grown up hearing stories about danger in the Wild West, but she never imagined she would be alone crossing a place that seemed forgotten even by the birds of the sky. Every sound made her heart jump. Every echo felt like a warning. Yet turning back was impossible because she had nowhere else to go. Her father had passed during a harsh winter. Her mother before that, and the small cabin they had once called home became nothing but silent wood. She had sold the last few belongings in town and bought a little food, a kettle, and a promise inside her heart that if she kept walking, she might find a new start. The land around her was beautiful but cruel, painted in deep red stones that looked like giant castle walls built by nature, shaped by storms and time. She tried to keep her pace steady, but a strange feeling slowly crawled up her spine. Not from fear of animals, but from something human, something she could sense without seeing. Looked back more than once, unsure if her mind was playing tricks or if someone truly followed her tracks. She continued deeper into the canyon, unaware that 4 riders were already moving behind her, staying far enough not to be seen, but close enough not to lose her trail. They did not come from any peaceful settlement nor from any lawful place. They had watched her buy supplies in the small trading post earlier that morning and noticed she traveled alone. In a land where law was weak and danger walked freely, a lone traveler was easy prey. One of the riders whispered that she would be scared enough to obey if they cornered her. Another nodded with a cold smirk, and the others said nothing, as though they had done this before. They wanted her supplies, her horse, and whatever else they decided once she had no choice. They were not starving men or desperate workers. They were hunters of the helpless, shaped by greed, not by survival. The woman reached a natural stone, an archway that stretched overhead like a bridge made by giants. She paused, taking a drink of water, unaware that this would be the last peaceful moment she might have. She heard distant hoofbeats, but tried to believe it belonged to harmless travelers passing through. She placed her hand on her horse to calm it, then whispered that everything would be fine. She started walking again, but this time the air felt heavier. Suddenly, the sound of hooves became clearer, no longer distant, but near, loud and closing fast. Her heart began to pound so hard she could hear it in her ears. She held her breath as she turned and saw 4 men riding straight toward her, blocking the path, spreading out so she could not escape. The first man climbed down from his horse with a slow, mocking smile, tipping his hat as if greeting someone at a town dance. His partner walked to her side, eyes sharp like a wolf ready to corner a lamb. She tried to appear calm, hoping words could help, but her voice trembled as she asked what they wanted. They did not need to answer. Their cold looks already told her she was caught in a dangerous situation. One of them grabbed the reins of her horse while another inspected her belongings, pretending to be polite but making it clear she had no say. The canyon echoed with their boots scraping against rock, the dry wind lifting dust around their feet like a quiet warning that nature itself disliked.
Their presence.
She stepped back and looked around, hoping there might be an exit. But the canyon twisted long and narrow, and she had walked deep inside without realizing she had trapped herself. The leader raised his hand, not to hit, but as a silent order for her to stay still. His tone changed, slow and heavy, telling her no one would be riding through this canyon at that hour. And by the time the sun set, no one would be able to hear anything if trouble happened. Her throat tightened as she looked up at the sky, trying to gather courage, praying someone somewhere might hear her. She had read stories of travelers saved by wandering ranch riders or nearby settlers, but no one could reach her here except fate. As the 4 men closed in, something changed in the wind, almost like a silent shift. A tiny pebble rolled down from the rock arch above them, hitting the ground near their boots. The men ignored it at first, but the woman looked up, sensing movement where no one should be. She narrowed her eyes and saw what looked like a shadow hidden behind the rock curve, almost blending into the ancient stone. Her breath caught as she realized someone was there, watching silently. Before she could blink, a figure slowly rose from behind the rocks, like a spirit awakened by danger. Bare feet, strong posture, long dark hair tied back, and a bow held with sharp confidence aimed down at the men below. His skin was painted with earth tones, the same color as the canyon, so he had become part of the land itself, without being seen. The men finally noticed the shift in her eyes and turned to look, their faces changing from certainty to shock. The figure on the rocks did not speak, did not shout, did not warn. His presence alone was enough to freeze every breath in that canyon. The woman felt her knees shake, but this time not only from fear but from hope. For the first time since entering that canyon, she felt she might not die alone. She did not know who he was or why he was there, whether he came from a nearby hidden camp or if he lived quietly among the rocks like a ghost of the desert. All she knew was that he was Apache, and his bow was pulled tight, ready, and pointed directly at the men surrounding her. The canyon became silent, holding its breath, waiting to see who would make the first move and who would leave that place alive. The man with the bow did not move even an inch as the wind pushed through the canyon and rattled loose sand across the rocks. The 4 men on the ground tried to act brave, but none of them lifted their hands toward their guns, knowing one wrong. Motion could turn the silent moment into something far worse. The woman felt her heart beating harder as she studied the stranger. His expression stayed calm, almost cold, but his eyes focused with sharp awareness that made it clear he was not someone who acted without thought. He stood barefoot but steady, his feet gripping the rock like he belonged to it. The leather strap across his chest carried a small pouch, and his bow looked handmade, carved with skill and care. She suddenly remembered stories told by travelers sitting near old campfires, like stories about Apache warriors who could strike without a sound, vanish into stone, and see danger long before others even sensed it. She never believed such tales were fully true. But now she stood beneath living proof. The leader of the 4 men tried to force a grin, raising his voice to sound confident, but it came out stiff. He called up to the stranger, saying they were only travelers and meant no harm. His partners looked at him like he was lying to himself more than to anyone else. The Apache did not lower his bow, nor relax his arms. He spoke slowly in a deep, steady tone, telling them to leave the canyon at once. Not tomorrow or later, but now. One of the men whispered something to the leader, but he shook his head. Understanding that the stranger was not guessing or threatening in a foolish way, he meant every word. The woman stood still, afraid to even breathe too loudly, her hands gripping her skirt to keep them from shaking. For a brief moment, she believed the men would leave. But the leader's pride would not allow him to walk away without a twisted sense of victory. He raised his hands calmly and claimed they only wanted supplies, nothing more, saying that sharing in the wild was a natural rule of survival. The Apache warrior responded that taking from the weak was not survival, but shame. The air between them grew colder, even under the burning sun. The leader exchanged glances with his men, realizing they were not the ones choosing what would happen next. He unclenched his jaw, stepped back, and signaled for his men to follow him out, at least for the moment. They pulled their horses away slowly, but their eyes carried a promise they would return. When they were far enough to no longer see her, face clearly, the warrior lowered his bow, but not completely. The woman waited for him to come down, but he did not rush. He stayed above her for several slow moments, watching both directions of the canyon, as if expecting hidden eyes. Only when he was sure danger had faded for that moment did he climb down the rocks with careful, quiet steps, like a hunter used to stalking shadows instead of walking openly. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She whispered her thanks with shaky breath. He studied her without blinking, his brows lowered in a way that made him appear neither angry nor gentle, only deeply aware. He asked how far she had traveled and why she crossed such a dangerous path alone. She explained that she had lost her home, had no family left, and was searching for a new place to work. Maybe near the distant mountains where she heard a settlement needed helping hands? His eyes softened slightly, but his tone stayed calm, warning that the land between the canyon and the mountains was not kind to those without allies or knowledge. He said the four men were not simply passing through, and that they had likely been hunting for someone easy to corner. She looked down in silence, knowing he was right and realizing how close she had come to losing everything. He asked if she had been eating well or drinking enough water on the trail, and she admitted that her supplies were already running low. She had eaten only bread and a little jerky since sunrise, hoping to stretch her food for at least 2 more days. He checked her horse carefully, noticing the weariness in its legs, then placed his palm on its neck, murmuring something soft in his own tongue. The horse seemed to calm immediately, like it understood a language older than the canyon walls. The woman watched, unsure whether she should trust him completely, yet feeling a strange sense of safety near him. He finally introduced himself using a name from his people, but she struggled to pronounce it correctly, and he told her she could shorten it if needed. He did not ask her for her full name, only what he should call her for now. She told him the simple name she used since childhood, and he nodded respectfully. He did not ask too many personal questions, but his silence felt thoughtful rather than distant. He warned that the four men would not forget this place or this moment, and that if she continued the same trail alone, they would likely catch her at a weaker hour, maybe at dusk, or when she tried to rest. She did not want to accept help, still carrying pride built from hardship. Yet her legs trembled with the truth that she had no real choice. She could see it in his eyes that he was not offering kindness because of pity, but because leaving her alone would go against his honor. The canyon breeze picked up, pulling her hair across her face. He looked around once more, searching for any trace of movement. He said it would be wiser to move now rather than wait for nightfall. She agreed, though she did not know where he planned to take her. He led her away from the canyon in a different direction, not back toward town, nor forward toward the mountains, but toward a path hidden between scattered rocks and dry bushes. She followed carefully, trying not to slip, while her horse walked behind. The trail looked like one only known by those who lived close to the earth. As they walked, she asked if he lived alone. He answered that not everything in life is spoken openly, and that the land itself sometimes listens. Though it sounded like a riddle, she respected his meaning. After some time, the narrow path opened into a small hidden area with trees, a patch of shade, and a stream flowing gently from between rock layers. It felt far safer than the canyon, untouched by footprints of unwanted men. He told her to drink and let her horse rest, while he knelt and examined distant tracks. His movements were slow and meaningful, like every step had its own purpose. She watched him quietly, wondering who he truly was, how long he had lived there, and whether he had family somewhere waiting for him. There was a sadness in his eyes that he never spoke about, but she recognized it because she carried the same kind. She finally built the courage to ask if he had known danger like hers before. He nodded without lifting his head, saying that many had walked through these lands thinking the Wild West was only a test of strength, not realizing it was also a test of heart, respect, and wisdom. He continued by saying that greed and fear had wounded the land more than storms or hunger ever could. His voice did not rise with anger, yet every word carried weight as they rested near the small stream. She confessed that she never planned to depend on anyone, especially a stranger. He replied that true strength was not walking alone until death, but knowing when to accept help without surrendering who you are. She lowered her gaze, understanding how close she had come to pretending she was stronger than she actually felt. He told her that he would guide her until she reached a safer place, but the journey would not be simple. He hinted that the four men would seek revenge not only because they failed, but because their pride could not accept losing to a single man who fought with a bow instead of guns. The sun moved slower above them, painting long shadows across the hidden ground. The woman felt her hope slowly returning, but the uncertainty ahead remained heavy. She could sense that the man was not only protecting her for that moment, but preparing for whatever might come. She asked where they would go next, but he looked toward the horizon with narrowed eyes and said only that the safest path was not always the straight one. She held her breath, realizing her journey was no longer simply about finding a job or shelter. Something larger had begun forming around her, something she did not yet understand. The wind grew stronger again, carrying a faint echo that did not belong to nature. They both heard it at the same moment, and the Apache warrior slowly reached for his bow once more. The safety of the hidden stream no longer felt as secure as it did moments ago. The woman tightened her hold on her horse, afraid to ask if they were being watched again. The warrior did not speak, for silence now carried more meaning than words. Their real test was only beginning. The Apache warrior held his breath and listened. The faint sound that had reached them did not come again right away, yet he stayed crouched, one hand on the ground as if the earth itself could tell him more than the wind. The woman watched him, trying to read his face. His eyes were half closed, his head tilted slightly, and she realized this was how he measured danger. To her, the canyon country was just rock and sagebrush. To him, it was a living thing that spoke in small signs most people never learned to notice. At last he rose and moved up the side of the rocks with soft, quick steps. He told her to stay near the stream and keep the horse quiet. He pointed to a patch of brush where she could stay hidden if anything happened. His tone was calm but left no room for argument. She did as he said, though every part of her wanted to follow. She crouched behind the brush, fingers pressing into the dirt, watching him climb until he vanished over the top of the rise with his bow in hand. While she waited, the quiet pressed on her. Her thoughts wandered back to the small town she had left behind. She remembered the worn wooden buildings on the frontier street, the smell of dust and smoke, the men who leaned against railings with careless eyes that weighed every traveler, measuring what could be taken. After her father died, she had tried to work at the boarding house, serving meals and cleaning rooms. But the owner's debt and the behavior of certain guests had made staying there feel more dangerous than the open road. She had seen how quickly a smile could turn into a demand, and how the weak were pushed aside in the Wild West unless they found someone to stand with them. A shout cracked across her memory, jerking her back to the present. It came from far away up the canyon, and she could not tell if it was anger or surprise. Then silence fell again. Her heart hammered. She almost stood to look, then forced herself to stay low, trusting the Apache warrior's warning. The horse shifted nervously, but did not whinny. Perhaps still feeling the calm he had given it earlier, up on the ridge. The warrior lay flat against the stone, scanning the canyon mouth. In the distance, he saw dust rising, thin but steady, like smoke from a slow fire. Through the haze he could make out riders. 4 of them. The same men. They were circling back, just as he had expected. They were not content to lose. Men like that believed the land belonged to whoever held the gun, and that anyone who opposed them needed to be taught a lesson. The warrior watched their formation, the way their heads moved, the way their horses carried them. These were not ranch hands or simple drifters. They were outlaws, the kind who survived off fear. He remembered a different day, many seasons earlier, when smoke had risen over a valley near his people's camp. He had been younger then, still learning the bow under his father's watchful eye. A small group of riders had come through, taking what they wanted, leaving families in grief. Since then, he had walked with a quiet vow inside him. He would not let those who preyed on the weak move through his homeland without challenge. He knew not every settler or rancher was cruel. Some had traded fairly with his people, even shared food in lean winters. But the men riding through the canyon now were not of that kind. The outlaws halted near the stone arch, where they had first trapped the woman. The leader scanned the rocks, jaw tight. One of his men, younger and less hardened, shifted in his saddle. He said he did not like the idea of going after a woman and an Apache alone in that kind of country. The leader snapped back that a bow and a lone horse were nothing against for rifles. Another man laughed in a harsh, empty way and pointed out that they had already wasted half a day. They needed supplies. They needed money. And they needed to show that no one could stand against them without paying a price. The younger rider held his tongue, but unease stayed in his eyes. He had once seen a family in a wagon robbed and left on the trail while he rode with another group. He remembered the look on the mother's face when their food was taken. The leader had told him it was just how the wild land worked. He had believed it for a while, But there was something different about this woman in the canyon. Something about the way she had stood, shaking yet trying to keep her voice steady, that now troubled him. From his hiding place above, the Apache took note of how the riders examined the canyon floor, looking for tracks. They eventually found the trail leading toward the hidden stream. The leader smiled with cold satisfaction and motioned them forward. The warrior slid back from the ridge and moved quickly down toward the woman. Time was shortening around them. He reached her side and spoke in a firm, low tone. The men had returned. They were following. He told her they needed to move again, and that the hidden place by the stream would no longer be safe once the riders reached the narrow path. She gathered her sack with clumsy fingers, nerves making her movements stiff. The warrior loosened a small knife at his belt, checked the string of his bow, and handed her a short stick, instructing her to brush away their footprints as they walked. She felt awkward but did as told, dragging the stick behind them. Instead of heading straight away from the canyon, he led her along the edge of the rocks, sometimes stepping on bare stone where no print would show. They followed a thin line of scrub brush, then angled toward a distant cluster of low hills. The woman asked where they were going now. He answered that there was an old trading cabin not far beyond the hills, run by a man who dealt with both Apache and settlers. If they were lucky, they could get more water and maybe learn how far the outlaws' reach spread. The journey to the hills was tense. Every bird call sounded like a warning. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper of coming danger. As they walked, the woman asked the warrior why he stayed alone instead of with his band. A shadow crossed his face. He said that many of his people had been forced from their old grounds, pushed onto distant soil, or taken as prisoners. Others had scattered into smaller groups, hiding where they could. He had chosen to stay near his childhood lands, watching the trails, guiding travelers when he could, and keeping an eye on those who hunted them. It was not an easy life, but it gave purpose to his pain. By late afternoon, the sun burned low over the hills when they finally saw the trading cabin. It sat crooked between two cottonwood trees, its roof patched with whatever boards the owner could find. A thin line of smoke rose from a stone chimney. Chickens scratched lazily in the dirt, and a mule chewed at a sparse patch of grass. The woman felt a flicker of relief at the sight of human life that did not immediately threaten her. The trader stepped out onto the small porch, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was older, with sunburned skin and a beard gone, mostly gray. His eyes took in the Apache warrior first, then the woman, then the tired horse. He nodded in recognition to the warrior and greeted him in a mix of Apache words and frontier talk, showing they had known each other a long time. The warrior introduced the woman simply as a traveler in need of safety. The trader's gaze lingered on her worn boots and the dust on her dress. He did not ask too many questions, which in that land was a kind of courtesy. Inside, the cabin smelled of coffee, leather, and dried herbs. Shelves lined the walls, holding tins, tools, and blankets. The trader gave them each a tin cup of water and a small slice of bread, saying he could not offer much without payment. But he would not turn away those in real need. The woman thanked him, feeling the dry ache in her throat ease with each swallow. The warrior asked quietly if any strangers had passed by that day. The trader's expression changed at once. He said 4 riders had come through not long before, all armed, with the look of men who did not care who they stepped on. They had asked if he had seen a woman traveling with an Apache. He had played dumb, saying he only saw dust and heard coyotes the night before. The leader had stared at him as if weighing whether he was lying, then bought a little tobacco and left. The trader admitted he had not liked their eyes or their easy talk of taking what they wanted. He told the warrior they were heading toward the very hills the 3 of them now sat beneath. The woman felt the walls of the small cabin closing in as she realized the outlaws were never far behind. She asked the trader if anyone in the nearest towns would stand up to men like that. He shook his head slowly. The sheriff in the nearest settlement was old and cautious. Ranchers cared more about keeping their herds safe than risking their lives over travelers with no kin. In the Wild West, justice often depended on whoever was willing to face a gun. The warrior paced once around the cabin, thoughts working behind his steady eyes. He could take the woman deeper into Apache land, where the outlaws might hesitate to follow. but that would risk drawing trouble to any families hiding there. He could try to lead the men into a narrow pass where the land gave him advantage in a fight. But for rifles, we're still for rifles. The woman watched him, sensing the weight of decisions pressing against his shoulders, as shadows grew longer outside. The trader suggested they stay the night and leave before dawn. The warrior agreed for the woman's sake, but looked toward the darkening horizon with a wary gaze. He knew the riders would not rest easy either. Men driven by pride and anger rarely slept well. Sure enough, miles away, the four outlaws had reached the edge of the hills. They saw faint signs of tracks in the dirt, partly brushed away yet still visible to a careful eye. The leader smiled that cold, thin smile again, certain they were close. The younger rider felt his stomach knot, but he said nothing. The group camped just long enough to feed their horses and then pressed on into the night, guided by the small marks left on the land. Back at the trading cabin, the woman lay on a bed of blankets in a small corner, staring at the wooden ceiling. She could hear the trader snoring softly in the other room and the quiet steps of the Apache just outside as he kept watch near the door, refusing to sleep while danger still prowled. She thought about the life she had hoped to find, simple work on a ranch or in a kitchen, not this desperate flight between outlaws and the deep silent land. Yet in the middle of her fear, there was something else blooming. A fragile respect for the warrior who had chosen to stand between her and the worst the frontier could throw at her. She almost drifted off when she heard the faintest thud outside, like a foot misplacing its weight. Then came the soft creak of wood, as if the wind had leaned too hard against the side of the cabin. The sounds were small, but in that tense night they felt huge. Outside, the Apache warrior froze, every sense alert. The trader's mule gave a sharp snort. Somewhere out in the darkness, a horse exhaled, and a saddle creaked again. This time clearer. The warrior reached for his bow, eyes narrowing as he stepped toward the corner of the cabin where the shadows were deepest. He could feel it now, that same heavy presence he had felt in the canyon, only closer. The four men were not far away at all. The night around the trading cabin held still, waiting to see who would move first. The night outside felt thick and heavy, as if every breath around the small trading cabin had turned into silent warning. The Apache warrior stood motionless near the corner of the cabin, watching the darkness through a narrow crack between the boards. He could not see full silhouettes, only slow, shadowy shapes, shifting under moonlight. But he was sure there were horses and men out there. The woman lay still on her blanket, holding the urge to whisper his name, though she knew any sound might place them in more danger. Even the old trader, though half asleep, seemed to sense something wrong in the air and turned on his side with a troubled groan. The Apache warrior moved quietly to the woman and motioned for her to get up and follow him without talking. He guided her to the opposite wall where a loose plank could be pushed aside, revealing a narrow passage behind the cabin leading to a small shed. She looked at him with uncertainty, silently asking if they should flee. He shook his head once. Leaving now would only expose them to the open field where the outlaws held the advantage. For the moment, the cabin walls gave them a thin layer of cover. He hoped the trader's presence might slow the outlaws from rushing in. A sudden scrape sounded near the front porch, as if someone had run a boot across wood. The mule outside gave a nervous snort and stomped its hoof. The Apache reached for his bow and pulled an arrow slowly, making sure no sound came from it. The woman pressed herself against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. She remembered every warning her father used to give her about the Wild West. How danger could walk on 2 feet and smile while planning something dark. Now she understood those words too clearly. A low voice called from outside, pretending to sound friendly, asking if the cabin owner was awake. The trader responded from his bed in a tired tone, hoping to delay trouble long enough for the warrior and the woman to prepare. He said it was late and asked what business they had at this hour. The leader of the outlaws answered that they needed help and supplies. His tone carried a false politeness that barely hid the threat beneath. The trader tried to sound calm, warning he had little to spare and no interest in trouble. The leader chuckled, saying trouble had already arrived. The Apache warrior looked at the woman and whispered so softly she barely heard. He said that once the door opened, Things could change quickly, and she needed to follow every instruction without hesitation, no matter how strange. She nodded, her hands trembling. He then handed her a tiny pouch filled with dried herbs and told her to keep it safe. She asked why, but he did not have time to explain. He moved back to the front door and positioned himself so he could react before any gun was drawn directly at him. Outside, the youngest outlaw spoke softly, expressing doubt about storming the cabin, saying it was not worth a fight. The leader silenced him harshly, saying that backing down was the same as surrender. He believed the Apache warrior had humiliated them in the canyon, and he refused to leave the hills empty-handed. The youngest man swallowed his fear, but kept his hand near his revolver. Torn between loyalty and conscience, the cabin door creaked when a fist pounded against it, demanding entry. The trader hesitated, then slowly lifted the wooden bar that locked it. As soon as the door opened a little, the leader forced his way inside with two others. The fourth outlaw stayed outside with the horses, scanning the dark field. The leader stepped in with quick eyes, sweeping every corner of the cabin in search of the Apache and the woman. He only saw the trader standing near the fire, trying to appear calm. He asked where the woman was, speaking as if she belonged to him, not as a free traveler. The trader answered that he had seen no woman, only a tired Apache warrior who came for water. The leader smirked, calling the trader a liar. He stepped closer, his hand inching toward his holster. One of his men kicked open a small cabinet, another shoved blankets aside near the bunk. The trader warned them not to destroy his home. The leader replied that the land was cruel, and homes meant nothing in places where strength ruled. The Apache warrior moved silently around the back of the trading cabin. Using the shed as cover, he listened carefully, waiting for the moment when the outlaws felt secure enough to drop their guard. The woman watched him from behind the loose plank, her body tense. She heard angry voices inside, boots stomping, and items breaking. Her chest felt tight with fear, not just for herself but for the trader who had shown compassion without asking for anything in return. The warrior circled toward the horses. Seeing that the outlaw who stayed outside stood with his back partially turned, this man seemed less confident than the others, looking around nervously, clutching his reins as if expecting ghosts to appear. The Apache studied him, wondering if fear might control him more than cruelty. Still, the horses nearby risked making noise if startled. So he stepped with extreme care, his feet feeling every inch of ground before he shifted his weight. Inside, the leader found a small strand of thread near the floor that did not match the trader's clothing. He pressed his boot on it and stared coldly at the trader, claiming this was proof someone else was there. The trader set his jaw and refused to betray the woman. Anger flared in the leader's eyes, and he grabbed the trader by the shirt, demanding answers. The cabin grew hotter with tension, as if the air itself had turned into flint. The Apache warrior returned quietly to the woman and whispered through the loose plank that they must be ready to leave fast. He said that once the outlaws realized the cabin was too small to hide anyone, they would start searching outside. He pushed the plank further open and motioned for her to climb through. Her hand shook as she slid into the shed, careful not to knock tools or boards. He followed, closing the plank behind them without sound. They moved toward the back exit of the shed, where the wall had a narrow gap between two logs. The warrior forced the wood slightly apart and created enough space for them to slip through. Once outside, they crouched low and crawled behind the tree line. The woman's heart pounded as she looked toward the hill's shadows behind them. She wished she could help the trader, but trusted the warrior's judgment that saving him required outsmarting the outlaws. Not rushing back blindly as they moved deeper into the brush, they heard the cabin door slam open, followed by yelling commands. The leader had realized they escaped and shouted at his men to search outside. The youngest outlaw's voice trembled with uncertainty, but he followed orders. The warrior helped the woman onto her horse and whispered instructions: do not run unless he said so. Stay hidden in the brush lines, and follow the path near the rocks where hoof prints could not easily mark. They moved quietly through the brush, using moonlight only when needed. She felt small branches catch her clothes, but she stayed silent. Her hands tightened around the reins, while her heart prayed they would not be spotted. Behind them, the outlaws fanned out, splitting into pairs. One group checked the stream area, and the other circled the brush looking for tracks. Every snapped twig sounded like thunder in the quiet night. They reached a point where the land sloped upward into rocky ledges. The warrior motioned for her to halt. He scanned the path ahead, then looked beyond into the open stretch, leading toward the foothills. He knew that if they reached the far ridge, the outlaw horses would have a harder time navigating. But there was one dangerous obstacle, an exposed clearing where they could easily be seen if the outlaws reached a higher vantage point. He took a deep breath and asked her if she trusted him. She answered yes, though fear wrapped around every word. He then said she must ride across the clearing without stopping while he stayed behind for a moment to slow the outlaws. She shook her head, terrified of leaving him, but he insisted. He reminded her that this was not just about running, but also about breaking the hunt. He believed she had strength even if she did not see it. She hesitated, tears forming in her eyes, then finally agreed. He guided her to the start of the clearing and placed his hand gently on the horse's neck. When he stepped back, she kicked forward, the horse moving with sudden urgency. She gripped the reins tightly, pushing through fear. Behind her, she heard voices echoing, boots pounding against dry soil, and the warrior's footsteps fading as he moved toward a new hiding place. As she crossed the clearing, every second felt like an eternity. Her heartbeat roared in her ears, the moonlight catching her pale face and dust-covered hair. She did not dare look back. She only focused on the far ridge where shadows offered safety. Somewhere behind her, the Apache warrior lifted his bow again, his eyes sharp, his breath calm. He watched the wicked riders emerge through the brush, closing the gap with determination. The chase had truly begun. And now, everything would be decided by courage, skill, and fate waiting beyond the ridge. Her horse ran fast across the wide-open clearing, and she leaned forward to keep her balance while the cold night wind stung her cheeks. She felt fear chasing her like a shadow that refused to let go. Her mind kept repeating the Apache warrior's words to not stop until she reached the rocky ridge ahead. She did not know if he was safe behind her or if the outlaws were closing in, but she held tight and trusted the path he chose. The moon guided her way like a silent guardian, glowing over the rugged land and giving her enough light to move with confidence. When she reached the ridge, the brush grew thicker and the trail turned narrow. She led her horse between two boulders, allowing the heavy shadows to swallow her presence. She stopped only when she could no longer hear her horse breathing loudly. Her heart beat hard against her ribs, and she whispered a quiet plea for the warrior's safety. She wanted to wait for him there, yet part of her feared that remaining still would bring danger closer. The rocky ridge curved like a natural shield, and she decided to hide behind it until she saw movement or heard a sign from him. Meanwhile, the Apache warrior crouched near a cluster of rocks just below the clearing. He watched the outlaws ride forward with angry determination, unaware that their horses would struggle to gain footing on the uneven terrain. He waited for the right moment, then released an arrow that struck the ground near their horses. It did not hit a man, but forced them to pull back and lose formation. He wanted to delay them, not take a life. The leader shouted in frustration and drew his revolver, firing blindly into the darkness. The shots echoed across the hills and scared nearby birds. None came close to the warrior. The youngest outlaw hesitated at the gunfire, shaking his head and saying that enough was enough. He claimed that chasing a woman and a lone Apache was not worth someone dying. The leader grew furious, calling him weak and threatening to leave him in the hills if he refused to follow orders. Fear and conscience battled inside the younger man until his voice cracked and he told the leader he would not ride any further. He turned his horse away and moved slowly back toward the main trail, no longer willing to be part of cruelty. The leader raised his hand as if planning to shoot him, but another outlaw stopped him, saying they did not have time to fight each other if they wanted to gain anything. Back at the ridge, the woman saw a small figure moving through the brush. At first she feared it was one of the riders, but then she recognized the Apache warrior's shape stepping into moonlight. Relief filled her eyes, and she rushed toward him. He signaled her to stay quiet until he confirmed they were no longer being followed. He listened for several long moments, then nodded. The outlaws were far behind and unlikely to continue into the rocky path at night. She finally exhaled and thanked him with her whole heart. Feeling safe for the first time since the canyon, he guided her deeper through the ridge until they reached a small flat space with enough shelter to rest. The wind calmed, and the stars seemed brighter above them. She settled beside her horse, while the warrior gathered a few dry sticks and made a small fire for warmth. He did it carefully so the flames stayed low, giving light without drawing attention. Once they sat near the fire, silence grew comfortable rather than frightening. She asked if he believed the outlaws would return again. He answered that greed usually fades when fear wins, and after tonight, they would think twice before coming back into those hills. She then asked about the herbs he gave her. Wondering why they mattered? He explained that the herbs were not for danger, but for healing and protection. They were meant as a reminder that she was no longer traveling alone, even if they became separated. She held the pouch close, appreciating the meaning more than the object, as the fire glowed softly. She shared more of her story, speaking about her childhood, the loss of her parents, and how she had dreamed of a peaceful life. She admitted that she once believed strength meant doing everything alone, but now understood that trusting someone did not make a person weak. The warrior listened with patience, never interrupting, and when she finished, he shared a little of his own past. He spoke about how his family once lived near a river with many willow trees. He explained how the land changed when others arrived, and how some of his people chose to stay hidden rather than lose their identity. He stayed because he could not forget the land that raised him. There was a long, quiet moment, but it did not feel empty. She looked at him with gentle eyes and thanked him, not only for saving her, but for treating her with respect and kindness when she had nothing left. She said he reminded her that honor still existed in the world. His expression softened, and he replied that courage shines brightest when fear surrounds it. At dawn, the sky turned soft, pink and gold, and the cold air slowly warmed. The warrior suggested they travel to a nearby settlement where he knew there were honest people who respected both Apache and settlers. He believed she could find work there without fear and start building the peaceful life she wanted. She agreed, not because she felt forced, but because she trusted his guidance and knew he genuinely wished her well. Their journey the next morning felt different. The fear that once followed them turned into quiet hope. The land looked gentler under daylight, and even the wind carried a calmer sound. When they arrived at the settlement, a few people recognized the warrior and greeted him respectfully. An older woman who managed a small lodge offered the traveler a room and promised to help her find work. She seemed kind and organized, and she welcomed the woman as though she were already part of the community. Before he left, the warrior stood with her outside the lodge. She felt sadness rising, not wanting him to walk away without knowing how deeply she valued him. She thanked him again, saying she would never forget him or what he did for her. He placed his hand over hers gently and said that paths in life sometimes cross for reasons no one sees at first. He told her that if she stayed true to her heart, the world would open for her even on the wild frontier. She promised she would. He then stepped back, gave a calm nod, and walked toward the open land with his bow across his back. She watched him disappear into the vast hills, feeling both grateful and inspired. She understood that he belonged to the earth, and that his mission was not to stay in one place, but to protect others silently in the days that followed. She found work helping prepare meals and caring for animals. The people treated her fairly, and she began to feel secure. At night, when she sat near the warm lodge fire, she sometimes touched the small pouch of herbs and smiled, remembering the brave Apache warrior who had appeared from the rocks when she felt completely alone. Rumors later spread that the outlaws left the region and did not dare return to the canyon or the trading cabin again. As time moved on, her life changed with steady progress. She built friendships, gathered small savings, and earned trust. Her story slowly became one of hope rather than fear. She learned that the Wild West, though harsh, also held kindness and honor when the right people crossed her path. She carried that lesson in her heart forever, knowing that courage, trust, and compassion were stronger than any gun or threat. And whenever the wind whispered through the hills, She felt certain the warrior still watched over the land, protecting those who traveled with nothing but faith and determination. Her new life was not built on fear, but on strength, gratitude, and a journey she would never forget.